Somewhere inside you right now, there might be a little bit of someone who wasn't quite human, not metaphorically, literally, buried in your DNA. Because for most of human history, you weren't the only kind of human around. There were others, different species, different faces, different ways of surviving. And one by one, every single one of them disappeared. Except yours. You are, right now, the only surviving branch of an entire family tree that once had several branches growing at the same time. That should feel strange. It should feel like a question worth asking. So what happened to the others? Start with the most famous one, the Neanderthals. For a long time, popular imagination painted them as dumb, hunched, primitive creatures, barely capable of thought. That picture is almost entirely wrong. Neanderthals controlled fire. They made tools specifically shaped for different tasks. They buried their dead, sometimes with objects placed carefully beside the body. They likely had language, or something close enough to it that the difference barely mattered. Their brains, on average, were actually slightly larger than yours. And they weren't alone either. Homo erectus survived for close to 2 million years, longer than your own species has existed by a wide margin. Denisovans lived across parts of Asia, known today mostly through a handful of bone fragments and an enormous amount of genetic evidence. Homo floresiensis, a small-bodied human relative nicknamed the Hobbit by researchers, survived on a remote Indonesian island until surprisingly recently in evolutionary terms. Multiple human species, overlapping in time, sometimes overlapping in the exact same regions. The paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer has spent much of his career mapping exactly how these species related to one another, and how modern humans eventually became the last one standing. Stringer's research suggests there's likely no single cause behind these extinctions. Instead, different pressures probably hit different species in different ways, at different times, across tens of thousands of years. So let's look at the pressures. Climate is one of the biggest. Ice ages didn't arrive gently. They came in dramatic swings, sometimes over just a few centuries, transforming lush landscapes into frozen tundra or arid steppe almost within a single lifetime's memory. A species finally adapted to one kind of environment could find that environment gone within a handful of generations. The archaeologist Clive Finlayson has studied exactly this kind of pressure in relation to Neanderthals specifically. Finlayson's research points to shrinking, fragmenting habitats near the end of the last ice age as a major factor. As usable territory shrank, Neanderthal populations likely became smaller and more isolated from one another. Smaller populations are more fragile. They recover from bad years less easily. A single harsh winter that a large, well-connected population might absorb without much trouble could push a small, scattered one toward collapse. But here's where it gets more complicated and more interesting. Around the time many of these other human species vanished, one particular species was expanding rapidly across the same landscapes. Yours. Modern humans arrived in Europe, in Asia, in regions long inhabited by Neanderthals and Denisovans, carrying certain advantages. Not necessarily bigger brains, not necessarily better bodies built for the cold, but possibly, according to some researchers, more flexible social networks, larger, more interconnected group sizes, the ability to maintain contact and trade across wider distances, spreading innovations faster and pooling resources across a broader web of relationships. If two species are competing for the same limited resources, even a small structural advantage, repeated across thousands of years and thousands of generations, can tip the balance completely. That doesn't necessarily mean violence, though it likely happened in some places. It might have looked more like slow displacement, better access to prime hunting grounds, more reliable trade networks during hard seasons, a slight edge repeated relentlessly until one population thrived while another slowly shrank. Here's the genuinely strange twist in all of this, though. They didn't fully disappear. The geneticist Svante Pääbo led the team that first successfully sequenced ancient Neanderthal DNA, a technical achievement that once seemed nearly impossible given how badly ancient genetic material degrades over tens of thousands of years. What Pääbo's research revealed reshaped the entire story. Modern humans outside of Africa carry Neanderthal DNA, typically somewhere between 1 and 2% of their genome. Some populations in parts of Asia and Oceania carry meaningful percentages of Denisovan DNA as well, which means the story isn't simply extinction, it's partial absorption. Somewhere, long ago, populations of modern humans and Neanderthals met, and at least some of the time, instead of purely competing or avoiding one another, they interbred. Their descendants carried both lineages forward. Over generations, as modern human populations grew larger and Neanderthal populations grew smaller, the distinct Neanderthal identity effectively dissolved into the much larger modern human gene pool. In a strange sense, they didn't entirely vanish. They were folded in. Some of that inherited DNA still does something today. Certain Certain Neanderthal gene variants found in modern populations are linked to immune system responses, skin and hair characteristics, and even how some people's bodies process fat and process certain diseases. Not major differences, but real ones, quietly inherited, still active in bodies today, tens of thousands of years after the species that first carried them stopped existing as a separate lineage. So think about what that actually means. You are the product of a bottleneck. Every other branch of the human family tree hit some combination of shrinking habitat, competition, isolation, and bad luck severe enough to end it. Your branch didn't, not because it was destined to succeed, but because of a long, uneven accumulation of small advantages, lucky timing, and, apparently, more interbreeding along the way than anyone expected. That's worth sitting with for a second. The line between still here and extinct wasn't some grand cosmic plan. It was closer to a coin that landed on your side tens of thousands of times in a row, across circumstances almost none of your ancestors could have understood or controlled. Now think about what's inside you. If you have European or Asian ancestry, there's a real chance that somewhere in your genome, buried in fragments too small to notice in daily life, a small percentage of you is quite literally Neanderthal. Not symbolically, genetically, a trace of a species that vanished as a separate lineage, but never fully disappeared from the world because it's still walking around inside you and millions of others right now. Every other human species eventually ran out of road. Climate turned against them, habitats shrank, competition tightened, and in some cases, absorption into your own species quietly rewrote what extinction even meant. You are the last one standing, not the strongest necessarily, not the smartest necessarily, just the one whose particular combination of luck, flexibility, and yes, occasional interbreeding happened to carry a version of humanity all the way to now. Somewhere inside you right now, there might be a little bit of someone who wasn't quite human. And in a very real sense, that means they never actually left.